The wind scraped across the dry land, lifting dust in thin, restless fingers that tangled in her skirts. Her boots were cracked, the leather split at the toes, and each step sent a jolt of pain through her arches. The baby whimpered against her shoulder, his cheeks raw from windburn. The girl, barely more than one herself, tightened her grip around his back. Her daughter walked behind, silent, too tired to cry anymore. They had been walking since first light. Her body no longer ached. It simply dragged forward, numb and mechanical, chasing the barest memory of warmth. The sun was sinking now, fat and red on the horizon, and the land stretched out in quiet accusation. Nothing moved except the crows. When she reached the edge of the town, she didn't recognize it. She had never been this far west. The buildings looked like something left behind in a bad season, wood warped and tired windows dull. A dry trough leaned against a post near the livery, the water inside gone to dust. She did not know the name of the town and did not care. She only needed one thing, a place to stop. The child on her back had gone limp. Her daughter's small hand clung to the frayed hem of her dress. She turned the corner and passed the church, one room, whitewashed, the door ajar. It smelled of mice and old books. She looked inside, hoping to find a place to rest even on the floor. But there was someone already there. He sat in the second pew, from the back, elbows on his knees, hat in his hands. A man built like the land's spare sun, browned with eyes like dry riverbeds. His coat was patched at the elbows and hung over the seat beside him. He didn't move when she entered, just looked up slow, like he already knew what kind of story this was. She hesitated. "I'll leave," she said, her voice rasping. "Just thought it was empty." The man stood. He didn't come toward her, didn't speak right away. He looked at the children, then at her. A long look. She was used to that, men measuring, deciding, calculating risk and burden. She braced herself for it. But it didn't come. Just a quiet nod. "You can sit," he said. "Ain't nobody here but God, and I doubt he minds." She moved to the far side near the wall and sank down slowly, her back pressed against the cold wood. Her daughter sat beside her, wide-eyed, her hands curled in her lap like she was trying to disappear. The baby shifted on her chest and whimpered. She shushed him, rocking gently. The man watched them a moment longer, then sat again, resting his hat on the floor beside his boot. It was silent for a while. The church held the kind of hush that could break you open. "You running from someone?" he asked at last, low and even. She didn't answer. Her fingers drifted over the baby's spine. "A man, maybe." She looked up then, just once. Her eyes were dark and dull with weariness, but there was still something in them. Not hope, just a stubborn refusal to be erased. "We ain't his no more," she said. He nodded again, like that was answer enough. Outside, the wind blew harder. A board slammed somewhere loose. The door creaked open a little wider, letting in a streak of orange light. Dust motes danced like ghosts in the beam. "I got a place," the man said. "Small. Not far. You could come by, rest the children. Nobody would bother you." She narrowed her eyes. "Why?" He looked at her straight. "Because you look like you ain't slept in days. And because your girl's feet are bleeding through her shoes." The mother looked down. It was true. The girl's socks were soaked, her toes raw from walking. She took a breath. It rattled in her lungs. "I don't know your name." "Don't matter right now," he said. "Just means I ain't owed nothing." She closed her eyes a moment. Then with slow hands she stood. Her legs trembled. She gathered the baby tighter to her chest, took her daughter's hand, and followed the man out into the dying light. The sun dropped below the hills as they walked. Coyotes sang in the distance, thin and sharp as broken glass. The dust swirled around their boots, but the man walked steady, each step measured, like he'd done this before. And maybe he had. The cabin sat low against the rise, as if it didn't want to be noticed. The wood had gone gray with age, roof patched with old tin and moss. A chicken coop leaned in the yard, crooked but sturdy, and smoke trailed from the stovepipe in a thin thread straight into the sky. The girl hesitated when they reached the porch. Her daughter clung to her skirt, now staring at the darkened windows like they might swallow her whole. The man didn't say anything, just opened the door and stepped aside. Inside it was warm. Not clean, not grand, but warm. The stove glowed with red coals. A rough-hewn table sat in the center of the room and 2 chairs. One wall held shelves of canned beans, peaches, and hard biscuit. Another had a cot. A second room stood closed off by a curtain. The girl stepped in slowly. Her arms trembled as she set the baby down on a folded blanket near the stove. He stirred but didn't wake. Her daughter looked around with wide, wary eyes and sat on the floor, knees hugged to her chest. The man poured water from a dented pitcher into a bowl and set it on the table. "You can wash up. There's a bar of soap if it hasn't wandered off." He pulled a towel from a nail on the wall and tossed it beside the bowl. "You hungry?" She nodded once. He opened a tin of beans, spooned them into a pot, and set it over the stove without saying more. The room filled with the scent of salt and smoke. Her stomach twisted with the weight of it. She sat down only when the man turned his back to chop wood outside. Her hands shook as she peeled her son's ragged coat away, checking for bruises. The boy stirred, hungry, but she had nothing left to offer him but a whisper and her arms. By the time the man came back and the baby was asleep again and the girl had washed the worst of the dust from her face, she looked younger now, though the shadows beneath her eyes stayed deep. Her daughter hadn't moved. He ladled beans into 3 tin bowls, passed them without ceremony. No prayer, no question. Just food, warm and real. The girl ate slow at first, then faster, until her spoon scraped the bottom. Her daughter didn't speak but ate every bite, her eyes never leaving the man's hand. "You got names?" he asked, quiet. The girl hesitated. Then Mara. She touched her daughter's shoulder. "This is Lacey. And the baby's Ellie." He nodded once. "Call me Silas." Mara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Her voice was hoarse. "I can work. Clean. Cook. Whatever needs doing. I ain't looking for charity." Silas didn't answer right away. He set his bowl down and leaned back in his chair. The fire cast lines across his face, made the creases in his skin look deeper. "I live quiet," he said. "Don't have folks comin' by. Don't owe anyone. I ain't askin' for nothin' I won't earn." He studied her, his eyes flicking from her face to her children. "You're welcome to stay. For now. Till you figure what's next." She bristled, lips tightening. "Ain't no next. We're here." His eyes didn't change. "Then be here." The silence between them wasn't cruel, just honest, like they both knew better than to pretend at safety. Outside, the wind picked up again, pushing at the windows with long, low sighs. Later, when the children were asleep, Lacey curled in a blanket by the stove, Ellie nestled against her side. Mara sat in the doorway, watching the stars appear in the black sky. She wrapped her arms around her knees and breathed in the cold. Silas came out after a while. He didn't sit, just stood on the porch, eyes scanning the horizon. "He come after you," he said. "You tell me." Her voice was barely a whisper. "You don't even know what I done." "Don't need to." She didn't look at him, just pulled her coat tighter and stared into the dark. "I shot him," she said. "Not to kill, just enough to make him stop." Silas nodded once. Not like a man approving, just a man listening. "I was 16 when he took me. Said he'd make me a wife. Gave me a room, a name, and 2 children. She swallowed hard. Never gave me peace." Still, he said nothing, just let her speak. "I thought if I ran far enough I'd vanish. Be nobody. Be free. She shook her head, tears catching in her lashes. But I'm still here. Still got dirt under my nails and fear in my throat. The sky above them was wide and still stars scattered like broken glass. Silas stepped back inside and returned a moment later with a folded wool blanket. He handed it to her without a word. She took it. He turned back to the door, paused, then said over his shoulder, "You ain't nobody," and closed the door behind him. If the land felt honest, subscribe for more truth. The mornings came slow on the plains, light seeping in like a secret through the cracks in the shutters. Mara was up before it reached the floorboards. Her body ached from sleeping upright, but she didn't complain. She hadn't had four walls and a roof in weeks. She moved quietly, careful not to wake Lacey or Eli. The stove still held some heat, so she fed it a few sticks of split pine and coaxed the flame alive. She boiled water, scrubbed her hands, then rinsed out the cloth diapers. The water turned gray in the basin. Outside, the wind had died. Frost silvered the grass. The chicken coop groaned as the birds stirred. She hadn't seen a clock in days, but she knew by the sun's angle that it was still early. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. She found a broom near the door and began to sweep, slow strokes, steady rhythm. The work made her feel like something solid, like maybe she wasn't just drifting anymore. Silas came in as she was shaking the dust rag outside. He carried 2 buckets from the well, arms bare in the cold. His shirt clung to him with sweat. "Water's stiff," he said. "Watch the pump, she kicks." Mara nodded. "Thank you." He didn't answer, just brushed past her and set the buckets down. Then, like it wasn't anything strange at all, he handed her a small brown sack. "Coffee?" "Not fresh ground, but warm." She stared at it for a second. The last time she'd had coffee was a year ago on the porch of a boarding house while Eli nursed. It had tasted like something borrowed from a better life. She brewed it in silence, poured 2 cups, handed him one. He took it, sat at the table, and didn't speak. Neither did she. That became the shape of their mornings. He showed her the well, the chickens, the back pasture. Told her which root cellar shelves held what. He had a soft way of talking, plain, slow, no push behind it. Lacey stayed close to Mara's skirt at first, but after 2 days she started following Silas when he fed the hens. He didn't coax her, just let her watch. Ellie took longer to trust. He cried at night, whimpering in his sleep until Mara pressed him to her chest and rocked him back to quiet. Some nights she cried 2 silent tears that slid down her cheeks and dried before morning. On the 5th day, Silas asked her to help with the fencing. The north pasture was falling apart. "You any good with nails?" "I've done worse," she said. The cold bit through her sleeves, but she didn't flinch. She took the hammer, lined the rail, and drove the iron home. Her hands blistered by midday, but she didn't stop. They worked until the sun fell behind the ridge. Lacey and Eli stayed with her the whole time, bundled in blankets on a tarp nearby. Silas watched them often, not out of suspicion, but something quieter. Consideration, maybe. That night she sat on the porch again while the stars came out. "You don't talk much," she said when he stepped outside. "Never saw the point in saying things folks already know." She glanced over at him. His silhouette was sharp against the pale sky, jaw, squared shoulders, tired. "You live alone long?" "Since my brother died," he said. She looked down at her hands. "You got family left?" He shook his head. "Not that counts." She didn't ask more. But something shifted in her, then a small, unexpected understanding. They were both made of the same kind of silence. The next morning she was already outside feeding the chickens when he stepped onto the porch. She didn't wait for instruction, just handed him a pail and said, "Fence still needs work." He smiled barely, but it was there. "It does at that." By the end of the week she could lift and carry the rails without help. Her hands were cracked, nails blackened, but her eyes were clearer. She moved with purpose now, like she belonged to the ground she walked on. One afternoon, Silas brought out a small wooden box. "This was my mother's," he said, holding it out. "She kept sewing things in it. I figured you might want it." Inside were needles, faded thread, a few buttons, and a scrap of blue fabric folded neat as a handkerchief. Mara took it with both hands. "Thank you." "You'll need it," he said. "Winter's not far." She watched him walk back toward the barn, his gait slow and sure, like a man who'd known loss and made peace with it. She touched the worn edge of the fabric and felt something in her chest loosen. Not joy. Not yet. But something like breath. The first snow came sudden, like the sky had been holding its breath too long. One morning the hills were bare. By sundown the earth lay quiet under a thin white sheet, soft as a shroud. Mara stood on the porch with Eli bundled against her shoulder and Lacey beside her, watching the flakes drift down. It wasn't much yet, just enough to muffle the world, but it shifted everything. The smell of smoke deepened. The trees stood stiller. Even the wind seemed to whisper now instead of scream. She had patched Lacey's boots with bits of rawhide and sewn Eli's sleeves tighter to keep the cold from his wrist. She wore a coat too big in the shoulders, Silas's, but she didn't give it back. He hadn't asked. Inside, Silas was fixing the hinges on the cellar door. He'd cleared a place for a second cot last week and hadn't said a word about it. He just built it like it had always been there, like they'd always been here. That evening, after the stew and the quiet, Silas sat in his usual place by the stove, sharpening a blade that had seen better years. Mara stitched at the torn edge of a curtain needle, flashing in the firelight. "Where'd you learn to sew like that?" he asked, voice low. She didn't look up. "A neighbor woman, back when I was a girl. She paid me in bread and buttons." He nodded, ran the whetstone slow along the steel. "My mother used to mend like that. Had hands like rope, but she could make a shirt out of nothing. She'd teach you the quiet." He gave a half smile. "No, I was born with it." They both fell silent again, but this time it felt companionable, the kind of quiet that came after trust had taken root, even if barely. Later, when the children were asleep, Silas reached for a small wooden box and the corner plane, scuffed a lock with no key. He sat with it a moment before he opened it. Inside were photographs, faded, curling at the edges. A man with a rifle, a woman holding a baby, a younger Silas, cleaner shaven eyes, sharp and proud. He didn't hand them to Mara. He just held one up to the light. "That's my brother," he said. "Jonah. 2 years older. He was meaner than me. Smarter, too." Mara didn't interrupt. "He got himself into trouble back in '92. Tried to break a wild colt that didn't want break and died out in the canyon alone. Took us 4 days to find him." Mara watched his fingers tighten around the photo, then loosen. "My folks were already gone. He was the last thing I had that belonged to anyone." She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "I know that kind of loss. I reckon you do." He put the photo back in the box and shut it. "You stayed after," she said. "Didn't leave?" "Someone had to watch the land. Feed the chickens. Keep the roof from falling." "You ever think about leaving?" "Some days. But it always felt like if I left I'd vanish. Like I'd never been." She nodded, slow. "I felt that. Every time I ran." He looked at her, then really looked. Not like a man weighing risk, but like a man seeing something he hadn't before. "You don't gotta run anymore," he said. The words landed quiet and sure between them. She didn't cry, but she did blink fast once. The days turned colder. They chopped wood, gathered what they could from the root cellar. Silas taught Lacey how to light the stove, how to crack an egg without breaking the yolk. Mara baked biscuits with what little flour they had left, and Silas said they tasted like something from before the war. The children laughed more. Eli took his first real steps across the cabin floor, arms flailing, grin wide and toothless. Silas caught him before he hit the stove and didn't let go right away. At night, when the wind howled, Mara pulled her children close, but the fear didn't claw at her like it used to. The silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like space room to breathe, to grow, to stay. On the first Sunday after the snow, Mara found herself walking to the church again, not for prayer, just to see it. The door creaked open just like before. The pews sat quiet in the dust. But it didn't feel hollow now. It felt like something waiting. She sat in the second pew from the back. When Silas walked in and sat beside her, neither one spoke. They didn't need to. By midwinter, the snow thickened, swallowing paths and blurring the lines between sky and earth. Wind pressed against the cabin like it meant to test the nails, but the walls held. Inside, the fire never died. It just dimmed and rose again like breath. Mara moved through the days with a quiet rhythm. Her hands stayed busy kneading dough, stitching seams, wiping soot from the glass chimney. Lacey learned to read by lantern light, tracing each letter with the tip of her finger. Ellie toddled after her, his feet steady now, his laugh sudden and wild. Silas added a shelf near the stove, just high enough to keep Eli from reaching it. He didn't say it was for her, but it held her things: thread-folded cloth, a jar of lard she'd managed to stretch for weeks. One morning she found a new bar of soap there. No note. No mention. Just there. Some nights after the children were asleep, she and Silas sat at the table, neither reaching for more words than needed. He told her about the time the well froze through, and he had to melt snow in a washtub just to wash. She told him how her father once taught her to trap rabbits with twine and a bent twig. Didn't catch much, he said, but it kept us trying. He nodded, sipping his coffee. Sometimes trying's the whole thing. The fire popped. The silence held. One evening, after a long day of mending and chopping, Lacey asked if they could go into town. Just for a look, she said. Maybe there's books. Mara hesitated. She hadn't stepped past the ridge since autumn. But the thought of Lacey in that cold, dusty church pew, mouthing out words with her brow furrowed, it tugged at something. Silas glanced over from the doorway. We'll take the wagon. Snow's packed enough to ride. The general store stood at the far end of town, its porch half buried in drift. A bell rang when they stepped inside, sharp and sudden. The warmth smelled of leather and cinnamon, and for a moment Mara forgot the weight on her shoulders. People turned. They always did. Some recognized Silas. A few nodded. One older woman narrowed her eyes at Mara, then looked down at the baby in her arms. She didn't smile. Mara straightened her spine. She didn't shrink anymore. Silas walked to the counter and spoke with the storekeep, a thin man with ink-stained fingers. Meanwhile, Lacey wandered toward a box of worn paperbacks near the stove. Mara followed, crouched beside her, flipping through pages stained with old thumbprints. Take 2, Silas said when he returned, handing Mara a small cloth bag of flour and a tin of dried apples. We'll manage. Back on the wagon, wind curling in from the west, Mara tucked the books under her coat to keep them dry. You didn't have to buy that, she said. I know. She looked at him, his profile cut against the white hills. You ever worry what people think? Only when they're right. She smiled, then slow and small. Back at the cabin, she unpacked the supplies, kneaded the dough, and set the books near Lacey's blanket. The child ran her fingers over the covers like they were gold. That night, when the wind howled through the eaves, Silas stood near the window, watching snow curl across the porch. Mara joined him, arms crossed tight against her chest. They'll talk, she said. They already do. You mind? He turned toward her. No. You. She looked past him at the children sleeping soundly beneath thick quilts, at the fire's low glow at the home they had built, without meaning to. "No," she said. He nodded once. "Then we're fine." The snow fell harder that night, thick and silent, blanketing the world in white. But inside everything held. Spring came late, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. The snow melted in slow, sullen drips, pooling in ruts beside the barn. Grass showed itself by inches, thin, stubborn blades that pushed up through the mud like they'd earned the right. Mara opened the windows the first morning. The wind didn't bite. The cabin smelled of earth again. Damp wood, wet straw, and something faintly green. Eli crawled through the open doorway and planted his hands in the thawed dirt. Lacey laughed when he fell backward into the mud. She didn't stop him. Let him fall. Let him cry and sit back up and try again. She watched from the porch, wiping her hands on a rag. The air held a softness she hadn't felt in months. Not quite warm, not quite safe, but near enough. Silas returned that afternoon with a load of seed potatoes and a sack of nails. He stepped down from the wagon, wiped his brow, and said, "You think that ground's ready to be worked?" Mara squinted toward the small patch of field behind the coop. "We can try." They worked side by side for hours, their boots sinking in the soft soil, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her arms ached, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that meant something would come of it. Later she sat on the porch steps, fingers caked in dirt, her breath slow and even. Silas handed her a tin cup of water and sat beside her. "Been meaning to ask," he said. "That ring you wear, you keep it on?" She looked down at the band of dull metal on her finger. It barely fit anymore. "It was the one I ran from." Silas didn't flinch, just nodded. "I keep it to remind me," she said, "of where I've been, of what I survived." He was quiet for a long time. "You know," he said finally, "you don't have to carry it forever." "I know." She twisted the ring once slow, then slid it off and placed it on the porch beside her. She didn't toss it, didn't smash it, just let it go. The wind picked up a little. The trees swayed, shedding what was left of their old skin. Eli babbled from the yard. Lacey chased chickens with a stick she claimed was a sword. Silas leaned back on his elbows. "You ever think about staying?" She looked over at him, eyes narrowed against the sun. "I've been staying. Staying." Mara turned that over in her mind. The word meant something different now. Not stuck, not trapped, but chosen. "I think I already did," she said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Handed it to her like it was nothing. She opened it. Inside was a silver ring, nothing fancy but clean, smooth, shaped with care. She traced it with her thumb, then looked up at him. "I had it made in town," he said, "a while back. Wasn't sure when to ask." Her throat tightened. "You don't owe me anything," he said, "but I'd be proud to build a life with you." "With them." Mara looked down at the children, theirs sprawled in the dirt and sunlight. "You sure?" she whispered. "I'm sure." She closed the cloth, slowly held it tight in her palm. "I ain't ever been asked. Not like this." "Well," he said, "now you have been." She didn't cry. Not then. She smiled, small and sharp, like something inside her had finally aligned. Later, when the sun dipped and the sky turned violet, she placed the old ring in a wooden box and tucked it on a shelf. She slipped the silver one on in its place. It fit. That night they sat at the table, firelight flickering, children asleep in their blankets. Silas reached across, took her hand without asking. She let him. Outside the frost gave way to dew. Inside spring had already begun. Summer came soft that year, not in a rush, not with heat that burned the breath from your lungs, but with a slow unfolding warm morning's long light, the creek running clear again. Wildflowers dotted the hill behind the barn. Bees hovered. Things lived and moved and bloomed. Mara woke early now, not out of fear but habit. She liked the way the world sounded before it got loud, birds rustling, the first scrape of the stove door, the creak of wood stretching in the morning sun. She would braid Lacey's hair while Eli babbled at her feet, one chubby hand holding tight to her skirts. Sometimes Silas came in from the fields, his shirt damp at the collar, and kissed her on the forehead like it was the most natural thing in the world. They didn't talk about the past much anymore. It still lived there just behind them, but it didn't haunt the corners of the room. It didn't steal their sleep. It had settled into the soil like something buried right. There were still hard days. Fences broke. Storms came. Silas hurt his shoulder trying to pull the old plow from the creek bank after a late rain, and Mara had to wrap it in a sling, scolding him under her breath, even as she fetched water and tucked a blanket around his leg. "Would been fine," he muttered. "You would been stuck in the mud with your pride and no supper," she answered. He smiled at that. Word spread slow through town, but it did spread. That the girl who ran that girl was living up at the Nolan place. With the children. With Silas. Some looked away when they passed in the store. Others nodded, cautious and brief. One woman with a red shawl whispered just loud enough for Mara to hear, "Poor man." Took her in like a stray. Mara didn't flinch, just held her head high and placed her coins flat on the counter. But later, when they rode back in the wagon, she sat quiet. Silas kept his hands on the reins, but said, "You want to leave, you just say the word." She looked at him, eyes steady. "No," she said, "not anymore." That night they lit the oil lamp late and pulled the table closer to the fire. Silas laid out the plans for a new addition, a proper bedroom, maybe two. Mara ran her fingers over the lines he'd drawn, imagining where the windows would go, where Lacey's bed might sit, where Eli would scatter his toys. "You think we'll need more room?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he looked up, his eyes soft but sure. "I do." Her hand dropped to her belly without thinking. She hadn't told him yet. Hadn't even let herself believe it fully. But now, in the warmth of the fire and the weight of his gaze, it felt safe to say it aloud. "There's another coming," she whispered. His mouth parted slightly. Then a breath. Then he stood and crossed the space between them and took her face in both his hands, as if he needed to feel her skin to believe it. "I thought maybe," he said. They didn't cry. Not either of them. But something passed between them that went deeper than tears. Something settled. Later that week, Mara took down the old ring box from the shelf. She walked with Lacey to the hill behind the barn where the grass grew high and the sun stayed longest. They dug a small hole together, lined it with wildflowers, and placed the ring inside. "What was it?" Lacey asked. "Something I used to carry," Mara said. "And you don't want it anymore." She looked out at the land, the cabin, the open road behind them. "No," she said. "I don't." They filled the hole and walked back hand in hand, the sun warm at their backs. Summer stretched wide before them, slow and golden, full of work and quiet joy. The past was still there, but it no longer led the story. It no longer decided the ending. They did. The trail waits for no one. Subscribe and move.